Okay, so today's lecture is going to be about prep time strategies. In other words, what you're doing during those 15 to 20 minutes, as well as content generation. So what's the best way to think of a lot of arguments? So this relates to what we talked about yesterday about like how your arguments should be structured, but this is really focusing on those on the time before the debate actually begins. So let's get right into it. Let's see. Okay. So here are the basics. I think it'll make more sense when I go into the rest of the slides. But basically, there are these three sections during your prep time, where first of all, you kind of think up of a couple arguments, you analyze what the motion's talking about, then you consider your own. Uh, oh, sorry. Actually, you know what? I'll go back to the slide at the end after you understand the rest of it. Otherwise, it's going to be too abstract. Let's start with what you actually have to do. So if you remember, in British parliamentary debating format, there are four teams. And so I'm going to split this up into what the opening two teams should be doing during their prep time, and then what the closing two teams should be doing. So opening government and opening opposition, in other words, the four people who speak first, they have these three things that they should be doing. First of all is something called silent preparation. In other words, you don't speak to your partner for about 2 minutes and you just sit there, you consider the motion, you've just heard it, and you think of some like the most obvious points and just the first thing that comes to your mind. And the reason why this is important is because if you start talking to your partner like 20 seconds after you've heard the motion, then both of you are going to have a very narrow mindset. The first thing that you say is going to influence your partner's thought process, which means now suddenly both of you are just going to think of the same arguments. On the other hand, if you don't speak for 2 minutes, most likely you're going to think of more varied points and you're not going to fall into the trap of just like thinking of the same stuff. So it's important to make sure you don't converge too early. You do want that silent preparation. Uh, can we get a raise of hands of which teams have already been doing this? Because it's not a very obvious thing to do. So it's unlikely that you've specifically set out time for silent preparation. Probably not, right? Yeah, but that's all right. So you should start by doing that. The second thing is the discussion. This is where the two of you should come together, start talking, and compare the arguments that you came up with in that first 2 minutes. And after that, after you've compared your arguments, you can see which ones are better, which ones actually work, and you can select the ones that you think you should actually say in the debate. I think for our purposes, it might not be really a selection criteria. Like maybe it's just everything that you came up with, you'll probably say in the debate. That's totally fine as well. But you should also decide who's going to say which argument and just sort out those basics. That's the next step. And finally, what you need to do is really get the weight of your speech down. In other words, the reasons, the impacts, a lot of the stuff that I was talking about before that really adds some like content to your speech. So there is still some like nuance here. What speaker one should be doing, so the person who speaks first, is that they write down all of the arguments. They leave some space on the paper below them where they're going to add more information. And then they add the analysis, the reasons, and the impacts. And like a lot of this is just like practical stuff where you need to leave space on your page so that you can add things. And maybe you put each argument on a new piece of paper, or you put each argument on a new like half sheet of paper. That's usually what I do. I usually start by writing my first argument at the top of my first page, my second argument halfway down, my third argument on a second piece of paper. So I know I have at least half a sheet of paper to add any kind of analysis or impacting that I want. The second speaker, on the other hand, should, although they can help a little with speaker one and like helping them develop some analysis, something like totally different they should also be focusing on is thinking of what is the opposition going to say. And this is another thing which maybe you haven't done too much of. Do raise your hand if you've been like already thinking of what the opposition is going to say during your 15 minutes. But you should be doing that. You should think of what they're going to say and think of rebuttal even before the debate has begun. A lot of the time, yeah, so Malolan, hopefully you've been doing that. A lot of the time, this is very useful because it's pretty obvious what the opposition's going to say. You don't have to wait until they speak to find out what their arguments are. Just based on the motion itself, just imagine you're in their shoes, imagine you're on that side of the motion. What would you say? If it's something like really obvious, then they're probably going to say it as well. And so you should think of a response before the debate begins. And this is called pre-rebuttal. In other words, rebutting them before they've even spoken. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'll quickly go into what the other two teams should be doing. As you can see, the first three steps are basically the same. So like most of the time, you're going to be doing similar things there as well. The main difference is some of the timings. Because you don't have to speak immediately when the debate begins, you can spend more time on discussing your arguments and less time on building the analysis and impacts for those arguments, because you can do that during the debate as well, right? But what's more important for your team when you're a closing team is making sure you have more varied arguments, and so you spend more time during that silent preparation and discussion, so that if a lot of your arguments are said by the opening team, you'll still have other arguments which haven't yet been said. Because that's the main kind of goal of your team as a closing team. You want to be able to say new things which haven't been mentioned before. And if you only think of two arguments, then most likely the opening team will say them, and then there's not much left you can do. So you need to make sure you think of, let's say, 4 arguments, so that even if 2 of them are taken, you still have 2 other things that you can say, even if they're less developed, right? So there's a bit of like prioritization that needs to go on there. But finally, there's this 4th section as well, which is during the debate, because you have a lot of time during the debate before it's your turn to speak. Like imagine you're the last speaker, you're like speaking 8th. In a professional debate where each person speaks for 5 minutes, like a bit over 5 minutes, you literally have like 35, 40, maybe even 45 minutes just because of how delays work and like the time in between speeches. So you have so much time before it's your turn to speak. For the purposes of this camp, you're probably not going to have 40 minutes before it's your turn to speak, just because like speeches aren't going for 6 minutes or 5 minutes necessarily, but you do still have time. And so during the debate, you should be noting down everything that the opposition says, thinking of like writing down your rebuttal below that, and evaluating your own arguments and adding on to them, just seeing if there are more reasons and impacts that you can add. Does that all make sense? Any questions up until now? Okay. Feel free to ask questions at any time, guys. But yeah, okay. So here's an example sheet of what your notes could look like. At the top, you write down the motion. In this case, it's this house believes that UK lockdowns did more harm than good. Then you probably write down what team you're in. So this person is on team opening government. And then you go into your arguments and your subheadings. So the main argument, or like the claim of the argument that he's written down, is that it increased the longevity of COVID's harms. In other words, he's saying that because the UK put lockdowns in place, COVID actually lasted longer. And like the kind of background reasoning behind that is something along the lines of, oh, people didn't gain immunity as quickly. And so below that, he's now written three different subheadings of impacts in this case, like a mixture of like kind of reasons and impacts. And he deliberately puts space underneath each point so that he can add to it. So this is especially useful if you're writing on paper, because then it's hard to edit. If you're typing, then you can kind of like add space as you go, so it's fine. But as you can see, he's left space in between each subheading so that he can add stuff as he goes along. Because most likely, you're going to think of your three subheadings first, and then think of like the detailed analysis underneath each one. So you're going to be like, okay, mental health, national economy, personal economy, and then you think about mental health and see what else you can add to it. So you need to have this kind of structure to your notes. Okay, that's more or less what you have to do in terms of just like your prep time strategy. Yeah, Malolan?
I didn't get that summary. I don't know how that is related to the like the headline which quickly summarizes your argument. I don't know how that's related to the rest of the part in the argument that he has written. It doesn't
Uh,
have any connections, right?
it does, but like for the purposes for now, I don't think you have to worry about it too much. The headline is basically the claim or headline I was talking about yesterday, which is the like first bullet point of your argument, which is what you're trying to prove. Um, honestly, like there are connections. I could go into it, but you don't have to worry about that too much for now. This is more just about the structure of your notes. Okay. Abir, did you have anything?
Um, can we get the PowerPoint after? Oh,
Uh,
when we
I
get
think
that
I've
time.
sent you. I think I've sent you the PowerPoint already. In my previous email where I sent you the YouTube link to la yesterday's lecture, I think I attached the PowerPoint to that. So do
Okay,
go and check.
okay, I'll
Okay.
check it.
So now, content generation. So this is about how do you think up of as many arguments as you can during such a short time period. And a lot of the time, at least in the last few days, maybe you've just been like kind of brainstorming in general, just seeing what you can come up with. But there is actually a very structured way you could go about this in order to make sure you think up of a lot of arguments, or at least think up of some arguments, because sometimes you like hear a motion and you have literally no idea what to do. So there are a few steps here. The first thing you should do when you hear a new motion is identify what is the problem that the motion is trying to solve. So uh, most of the time, the reason why a motion would be getting implemented, like the reason why a sugar tax would be implemented, the reason why lockdowns uh, were implemented, is because there was a problem that the country was trying to solve. Either that's obesity rates, or maybe it's the spread of COVID, all of those things. These are like key issues which we're trying to solve, probably on both sides of the motion. So then it becomes an issue of, we know the problem we're trying to solve. Is the motion the best solution to that problem? And quite often it can be useful to generalize these problems into like different types. So social, political, economical, um, in the sense that maybe a specific motion has multiple problems that it's trying to solve. So if you think of it in categories, then it might be easier to identify those problems. So in the case of lockdowns, there's probably like the social problem of people getting infected by COVID, but there's likely an economical issue as well about what's the best way to um, like raise the GDP again and make sure the economy is running at full force as quickly as possible because COVID has damaged the economy a lot. So that's kind of the first step. And this should be like a relatively quick bit of the content generation process. After you've figured out what the problem is, you need to consider the key clashes. The word clash is comes up in debating quite a lot. It's basically just something which the proposition and opposition teams fundamentally disagree on. So, for example, if the motion was this house would ban gambling, then the problem which we're trying to solve is gambling addicts, right? Like a lot of people get addicted to gambling, and hopefully if we banned gambling, we might be able to solve that. So that's the main problem. In terms of what the key clashes are, the key clash might be about who gets who prevents really bad addictions more. So if you ban gambling, then maybe you decrease overall addictions just because of how gambling is less accessible and less available. But opposition could focus on this key clash about the severity of your addiction and say that if gambling moves to illegal platforms, then it becomes hidden, it becomes worse, and now the people who are doing it illegally could very easily get even more addicted because there's literally no kind of regulation on it. You don't have to worry about it too much, but in essence, they're key clashes, and usually if you're able to win on multiple key clashes, you tend to win the debate. So in this sense, the key clash is kind of a subset of what the initial problem was. The initial problem is just people getting addicted. This specific key clash is about really bad addictions and who solves them better, right? Thirdly is stakeholders. I think this is probably the most important bit. I think this is usually where I tend to get my the greatest amount of content generation. A stakeholder is basically a person who is affected by the motion. So there are three things you should be considering with stakeholders: how they're affected, how their incentives change, and how they're going to react, right? And this is very, very important because a lot of the time you're going to be thinking about certain stakeholders and completely ignoring others. But if only you considered them, you'd think of another two fully new arguments. So this is where most of the content generation comes in for me. An example would be legalizing drugs or legalizing marijuana. Your obvious stakeholders would be maybe people who take drugs and people who currently don't take drugs. And maybe you're saying things like, oh, if you legalize drugs, then people who don't take drugs currently might start taking drugs, right? That could be one of your arguments. But something which you might not think of very easily at the start of the debate is pharmaceutical corporations being a very important stakeholder. So it's not always going to be the most the first thing that comes to mind, but if you're focusing on identifying stakeholders specifically, then you most likely will consider pharmaceutical companies as well, because they're the ones making these drugs. They're the ones who could sell marijuana if it was legalized, right? And so then there are a lot of other arguments that you can say, such as, oh, these pharmaceutical companies probably want drugs to be legalized because they can make a lot of money off of them. They're probably going to sell a lot, but at the same time, they're probably going to make sure that the drugs are safe and regulated because they don't want to get sued if they start selling unsafe drugs, right? So a whole new area of the debate opens up once you consider pharmaceutical corporations as another stakeholder. Hopefully that makes sense. The last bit is about solvency. And what this means is, at the start, you considered a problem, And now you should be considering and explaining how exactly have you solved the problem and why have you solved it like as best as possible. And the main way to do this, I've already talked a bit about impacting and like I've touched on weighing as well. The main thing which I haven't yet talked about is uniqueness, which is to say, why are the arguments I've said and the impacts that I've brought unique to my side of the motion? Why is it impossible for the opposition to claim the same benefits? And you'll have to think a bit about why that would be the case. But if you're able to explain how the problem can only be solved using your specific method, then that should win you the debate. Are there any questions there? I'd say focus on stakeholders, honestly. That's the most important bit. Malolan?
Yeah, can you just tell me why uniqueness helps?
Sure. So if you give an argument which isn't unique, so let's say the motion's about working from home or working in person, and you say that, oh, working from home's better because, I don't know, you get to spend more time um, over the weekend with your children. Like, that doesn't make sense because like it's true on both sides. Like that's not a great example because it's like maybe too obvious. But a lot of the time what happens is people say things just considering their side. They're thinking, oh, what are benefits on my side? What are benefits on my side? And they're like, okay, on the weekend you can spend time with your children without like fully realizing that, oh, even if you worked in person, that would be true anyway. Like I think the examples may be too obvious, so no one would actually end up saying that. But in more complicated debates, that actually happens quite often, where you say something which is just true for both sides of the debate. So there's just like there's no benefit to saying it. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense. But like that was a bad example.
Yeah, that helps.
Any other questions? Okay. So now just like a final bit about the sequence of events and like some general tips. So let's say the motion was about making vaccinations mandatory. The problem here is that some people aren't getting vaccinated, right? Like they're anti-vaxxers, and we want to make sure everyone gets vaccinated, and so we're implementing a new policy where it's mandatory. The key clash is how do we get the most people vaccinated? So in this case, the key clash comes like very directly from the problem. It's like very straightforward. The actors here are quite important. So you have anti-vaxxers, you have your vaccine takers who already take vaccines, and you have the government, who is the one trying to enforce this policy, who's the one making it mandatory. Solvency wise, like I've written some stuff here, but I'll try kind of like saying a different solvency method as well. One way that you could think about solvency in this scenario would be about like how convincing are you to anti-vaxxers? Or like basically what opposition is going to say is that it's not a great way to achieve solvency because of maybe backlash that you would get from making this mandatory. So like anti-vaxxers are often very much against vaccinations. And so if your solution is something that like is riling them up, making them very angry at the government, and they're probably not going to be very happy, then that's not a very good way to achieve solvency, even if you get like more people vaccinated. Or you could even say that like it's so bad and like people hate it so much that they would literally go against the policy and like like riot or really go on the streets and make sure this policy doesn't get implemented properly. So like there are ways that you can talk about will you actually get more people vaccinated? If you do something that's like really going against the core principles of these anti-vaxxers, then maybe that's not actually the best solution. And a better solution would be a education campaign that teaches people more about why vaccinations are so important. Okay, finally, let's talk about what you should be doing during the debate. This is the last bit. So I think a lot of the time, people kind of just like focus during those first 15 minutes, but then just shut off. They just like stop paying attention or stop really like writing things down once the debate begins. But remember, you should be writing things down up until your speech. So at no point should you just be like sitting there listening to other people speak and thinking, okay, I've done my 15 minutes of prep. I'll probably be fine for my speech. No, you should be writing things down the whole time. If it's the opposition speaking, then you should be writing down what they say so you know what rebuttal you want to give. And if it's your partner speech, then you probably don't have to focus as much. But what that means is that you can focus on your own arguments and make sure you develop them further. So that's quite important. Another thing to do is compare clashes. So once you hear both sides of the debate and you've heard what your partner's saying, what like your teams are saying, and the opposition, you should be able to kind of internalize what's the main thing that people are arguing about. Maybe it's not what you expected, but you should identify like the thing that the teams are going back and forth about and really hammer down on like and think of 3 reasons why your side wins that like argument. I'm sure like there have been debates in the past 2-3 days where there are like 3 or 4 different speakers that talk about the same point and like kind of go back and forth. So you need to make sure when it's your turn to speak, you can like put that to rest, really make sure your side wins that clash. So to do that, you need to like identify the clash, think of 3 reasons why your side wins it, and then like deliver them effectively. And finally, just some basic tips. Leave space under each argument. I'd say like, I mean, you know best, but personally, I would leave at least half a page under each new argument. Secondly, you could have a rebuttal sheet. That's what I do as well. I have a different sheet of paper where I'm writing down what other teams are saying. And so I can also write down my rebuttal on a different sheet. So it's not like very messy with my own arguments. And finally, you can keep arguments separate, such as having different colored pens. Honestly, that's like a bit tricky if you don't like have those resources, but different sheets of paper makes a lot of sense for everyone. And so those are just some like basic tips about how you should be laying out your notes. That's the end. Any questions, or else we can get into the debate. Malola?
So basically, solvency is just how unique or like how good your solution is. Assessing how good your solution is, right?
Yeah, in a sense. Yeah. Agastya?
When you showed us like the diagram of how to do the notes, can we do like the same thing they did, like with 3 and then spaces? Are we allowed to do, can we use that?
Yeah, of course. That's what you should be doing.
Okay.